I mean, I certainly have nothing to offer to a discussion on the probabilistic resource assessment using experimental design in second-order and local businesses. Turn to the science community for help to get the resource back online and to manage it sustainably for the future. The science community contributed significantly to a in the region and assisted in developing a set of internationally recognized regulations and management guidelines. I'm pleased to say that some 30 years later, the benefits being derived from geothermal energy in that area are better than ever. However, as I reflect on the rise and the fall and the rise of geothermal energy, I think there are a few key lessons. The first one is geothermal energy is simply industrial heat. It can be used for fun, relaxation, business, and in some cases, generating electricity. Each of these uses can have a positive impact for the economy and for the community. Sustainable geothermal energy requires good science to understand what is under the ground, to manage risks, costs down, and to set realistic project expectations. Without good science, you are simply flying blind. Geothermal resources need to be protected and managed if they are to survive. This requires many groups of people working together in ways that they've never worked together before. So while Taiwan is on its own geothermal journey with unique issues, I would suggest that there is value in reflecting on these lessons from New Zealand. What are the best ways for Taiwan to use this source of heat? How can Taiwan access and fund the best that science has to offer to manage risks, manage costs? How can Taiwan ensure that this resource is available for generations to come? I would suggest to you that the answer to these and other key questions lies in working with people who have done it before. People like the international guests who will be speaking soon. And this conference is your opportunity to listen to them, to ask them really difficult questions, and to look for partnership opportunities, not only with these experts, but with the wider New Zealand geothermal community. I believe it's through these types of interactions that you'll discover what is best for Taiwan. So it seems my role as the director of the New Zealand Trade Development Centre here in Taiwan, that my connection with geothermal energy continues. And I'm very pleased to be able to play my very small part in Taiwan developing this resource for the benefit of all Taiwanese. And I wish you all the best for this conference. Thank
you. Now we would like to invite all the speakers, conference hosts, and the please stay on the stage to take a good photo. So please come to the stage and mind your step. We will now proceed with the keynote speech of this conference today. The moderator for this session is Dr. Ouyang Xiang. Dr. Ouyang is an experienced geology expert and the principal researcher in Tree. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Oh Yang.
Thank you, Vivian. My name is Oh Yang, and it's my pleasure to be your host for this session, keynote speech session. And we have 3 keynote speeches this afternoon, and followed by a panel discussion. And the theme of this keynote speech session, country update and experience sharing. And I would like to introduce the first speaker. It's Dr. Rosalind Archer. Rosalind is the Managing Director of Geothermal Institute at the University of Auckland. During 2000 to 2002, Rosalind applied the teaching experiences at Stanford University and the Texas A&M University. From 2003, Rosalind back to New Zealand and provide technical expertise in the project management for geothermal reservoir engineering and the system characterization of geothermal reservoirs and geostatistical methods on reservoir modeling and the monitor geothermal reserves. It also includes the well testing and the reservoir simulation. Rosalind also geothermal expertise all over the world, including many countries: China, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Japan, India, Algeria, and Africa, and of course USA and Mexico, South America, Russia, many countries. And her topic this afternoon is the international success in geothermal. Let's welcome Rosalind.
To speak to you all about from a very intimate and one from Adrian's remarks. I leave things that Adrian was referring to, including proxy models that were revealed, but it's always work that is done with a real sense of purpose in terms of managing our resource. So, in terms of bringing an international context to geothermal, these points outlines that I'm going to discuss today. I know from some Taiwanese colleagues of yours that came to the New Zealand Geothermal Workshop that they're always liked to take that expertise to the world and to share that expertise. So this image is the Prime Minister of New Zealand, at the time on the right, at the opening of the Phok-jû geothermal plant in Indonesia in 1982. So that began geothermal in Indonesia. Similarly, we have been involved in geothermal in the Philippines, right back to the beginning of the geothermal industry in the Philippines. So these shots are from Leyte and Calampinon geothermal fields. So we're currently at the end of the world, but we're always looking outwards into that world and looking to participate. We've only accessed about 15% of reasonable need is available. So there's a lot of opportunity out there in terms of tapping into resources. But one of the things that holds people back in terms of accessing those is this rather unique obstacle that geothermal has in terms of the upfront costs, the large checks that somebody is going to have to write to drill wells and build plant. The advantage, on the other hand, is that geothermal doesn't pay for its fuel. So if you go and build a power station burning natural gas or coal or diesel, you write a check every month for your fuel bill. It's a large check. Whereas geothermal, there is no price paid per se for every unit of steam or brine that comes from underground. But in return, you have spent a lot of money drilling and building the plant. And you face, when you write those large checks, you face this risk that things may not work. The geothermal resource may not be there, it may not be big enough, it may not be hot enough. But the World Bank in the past few years has published an excellent study looking at mechanisms around the world that are promoting facilitated geothermal. So there are a few listed on the screen there. The first option is that the government backs the development, or at least in the second option that the government shares the cost. And then there are other incentives and insurance options that governments can use to try to support development. So in the first part of the talk, I'm going to work through some of those options and give you examples of where that's happening in the world. So the risk profile for geothermal that gets quoted a lot in various forms, and the challenge with the risk profile in this way, so your risk remains quite significant for several years while you do surface exploration drilling, and doesn't start to drop until you've done more drilling, drilled more wells. And here in their example, we're keeping track of how much money has been spent in the project. So by the time the risks start to drop, you could have spent 20, 30, 40, 50 million dollars on the project with still no guarantee of success. And these numbers are examples, but are indicative of reasonable scale projects. So who is going to carry that risk in the beginning of the process? So the first option in the World Bank report is that the government does. And in many ways, that is how New Zealand accessed its geothermal resource. So Greg is going to speak about New Zealand, but the key point on New Zealand is in many ways, we took a lot of the risk away early in the life of our geothermal journey because our government drilled wells, they did surface reconnaissance themselves through government agencies. So in a government-backed development process, that could go all the way, a government operating an actual power plant, or it could transfer that power plant through to an independent power producer with an agreement to build and operate the plant. So of the installed capacity in the world, about 3.5 gigawatts, about 1/3 of installed capacity, has been built under this model. So you see there that government support has been absolutely key, the first 1/3 of geothermal capacity on stream. And that's a common example in Philippines, in Mexico. Many countries have examples of this sort of thing. So there should be a table here of the number of fields that have been backed by government through development stages and the number of megawatts that have been produced as a result. So if the government is going to do that, it requires government agencies to have technical, financial, regulatory expertise, either internally or leeway to access those kinds of skills externally. It needs those agencies to have the flexibility to work right through the process, ensuring targets, evaluating them, monitoring performance, getting external peer review. And in some countries, and I'm not implying Taiwan, I'm implying another country in particular that's famous for this. In some countries where you have many government agencies involved, no matter how well-meaning the agencies are, we do see scenarios where the agencies all get in each other's way and nothing actually happens. So that's not a great outcome. So ideally, if the government is going to be backing development, it needs a clear mandate on who is doing that and how it's being done. The next model is a cost-sharing model. So in a cost-sharing model, the government will fund part of the exploration costs by giving a grant to a private developer. So there the private developer is going to carry out the drilling, but they have some financial backing from the government. So they are putting less of their capital at risk up front. And that reduces their exposure to what we are calling resource risk of the geothermal resource not being at a good enough temperature or a good enough size to get a project. So this has been shown by the World Bank's study to be an excellent way to mobilise geothermal development in countries. In current geothermal development, we're seeing versions of this in Africa. So I just got back from Africa a few weeks ago, where they have a geothermal risk mitigation fund. And that risk mitigation fund is essentially a cost share. So it's a cost share for exploration drilling or for surface studies, where you can get up to 40% of 2 exploration wells, funded through, in this example, a coalition of international donor agencies who want to see geothermal proceed in Africa. So by putting up 40% of the cost privately, they're really trying to make things happen. This fund is relatively new, but when I spoke to their headquarters a few weeks ago, they do have a good number of projects now being given permission to access that funding. We also see examples around the world where the government actually does the drilling. So the text here has an example from San Jacinto in Nicaragua, where the existence of the geothermal resource was proven with publicly funded exploration, government exploration, but ultimately the development moved to a private developer. So there was a transfer of ownership here. So this table has a summary of the number of geothermal fields and the number of megawatts that have been supported by these kinds of models of cost sharing between private industry and government. And this is, again, almost a third of global geothermal capacity has been supported this way. There are some other incentives which I will say less about. So here in Taiwan, I understand that you have a feed-in tariff model as an option. There are various models around tax credits and renewable portfolio standards where governments can try and regulate. But many of these don't directly address that upfront resource risk and that high capital cost of a geothermal project. So if we now think about drilling, and drilling being one of the key cost components in a geothermal project early on, what success are we likely to have when we drill? Assuming we've got competent experts doing all their planning, it's never going to be 100%. So there is an excellent report from the IFC, the International Finance Corporation. They have studied what they believe to be 70% of the world's geothermal wells in 14 different countries, and looked at the success of those wells. And success can mean different things to different people. So often if I'm at work, I might ask someone, well, what does success look like? Because it can look like different things for different people. Is it return on investment? Is it megawatts? Is it a particular temperature or enthalpy? So success may have different definitions in different places, and this project did have to make some assumptions sometimes as to what success looked like, but essentially their measure of success is that you get a well that has a reasonable sort of generation capacity for what you would expect in the area. So here is a typical project, and we actually go back to Phok-jû, back to the first Indonesia, the data in different fields, because often a developer is interested in variability. So ultimately, Kamujang, the wells were about sort of successful 2/3 of the time. Is that always true? So here we see wide variability in success rates per field. Some fields here only 30 to 40% success rates. Some fields here very good, 90 to 100% success rates. So you get a sense of the spread. So just because one field has seen a certain success rate, that doesn't really transfer to another field. The other way to test this data is to look at phases of the project. So these bars are coded: exploration, development, and operation. And probably the key message from this slide, which has percentage success rate in the different phases of the project, is in the exploration phase, there's all sorts of success rates. So some projects got lucky and 90% of their exploration wells were successful, whereas some projects were very unlucky and saw 10% of their exploration wells successful. So huge variability in drilling success early on, and then later in life, in the more operational end of the project, you're more confident what's going to happen. Another view on this data set is in time. So thinking about, have we actually got better globally as an industry in time? So here we have percentage of success, drilling success by decade, by time. And this is generally tracking up. So the good news story here is that the exploration wells, which are coloured in red this time, our success for exploration well drilling has actually improved over time, quite significantly. So modern practices are making a difference in improving success rates. Modern practices, including some of the things that you'll hear tomorrow, for instance, when Samantha from GNS talks about conceptual modelling, the idea that we bring all the different disciplines together to build up a shared concept of what the subsurface looks like. That is going to help make wells much better. And then finally, I have the data set analysed by geologic. So these geologic types are coded. Number one is granitic rocks, is older volcanics, 3 is younger volcanics, 4 and 5 are sedimentary. So the volcanics are doing better. We have both capacity, well capacity, and megawatts electrical in blue, and success rate in red. So the geology you're drilling into definitely matters. So I would always be thinking about, if you're doing something in Taiwan that is relatively new, thinking about what analogues are there internationally that have similar sorts of geology, and then using a chart like this to think about what that may imply. So if we're going to be drilling, we want about our expenditure on drilling. So drilling is one of the key drivers of that increase in cost early project when our risks are very high. So we want to first of all be drilling in the best possible places, and we want to be drilling with the best possible methods. Drilling is very attractive there. Slim hole drilling is drilling a smaller diameter well. It's easier to drill actually. And then I can think about overall drilling budget. Cheaper, I can afford to drill more slim hole wells and get a better understanding of the system in 3D. So, so temperature gradient well, you're only drilling relatively shallow, 200 to 800 meters. And there you're trying to think about the presence of, talking with my hands, trying to think about the presence of clay conductors, trying to confirm the temperature in the upper part of the zone. A deep swim hole goes even further. A deep swim hole may go down to 2,000 metres down. And that is getting down to into reservoir zones. So you're actually learning about in the reservoir zones, you're able to sample the zones, so you can look at chemistry, you're able to take core, take cuttings, and really learn all about the reservoir. Right, so the dimensions here, PC is production casing. So the production casing is as small as 2 3/4 inches or up to 7 inches, whereas a standard well or a large well is 9 5/8 of an inch up to 13 3/8 of an inch. So much smaller well, smaller, cheaper well. So the downside is if I do drill into reservoir and I find reservoir and I find permeability, I have heat, I have permeability, I have fluid that wants to flow, now I've only got a much smaller diameter connection between the reservoir and the surface. So sometimes people criticise slim hole wells, saying, oh, but you can't run them as a production well. That's not necessarily true. Many people now are running these smaller diameter wells as production wells that have been drilled more cheaply. So here's a well on test in Guatemala, 1,300, and it's very definitely a slim hole size and is producing 1 megawatt electrical at a much lower cost than a larger diameter well. Some of the pros and cons borrowed from this table of the McKinsey paper from Jacobs. A radical project, a greenfield project, so a new system where we have cost the year of the project. So this is cost, and they've modelled the for full-size wells. The difference is this early stage part. This early stage part, you're spending money on this risk. Think about is how can I improve as in many ways the question you have some maps, some things that apply to a geothermal system. What's the least amount of money I can spend to prove it doesn't exist? Because if it doesn't exist, then as a developer I pack up and move away. So if we think about that process in a conventional sized wells, we do the same sorts of things at the beginning in terms of organising our land access and mobilising to do geoscientific surface work. So we've spent the same amount of money before we drill, but in the slim hole drilling, much cheaper. So regular spending 60 million in this example, slim hole wells spending 20 million. And it's at that point there where I have a yes/no decision on my exploration to say, do I continue to the next phase of my project? Do I can get more money and do further appraisal drilling? And each of us thinks about how much money I may have lost if the project doesn't work out at that point. So I have a much cheaper exit point from the project if I'm using slim holes. The final thing that I want to touch on is assume now that we have, regardless of what size wells we've drilled, and looked at the efficiency by which they convert heat energy into megawatts electrical. Lower enthalpy fluids, and then the flash plants and other variations further along the curve. And he's found that these conveniently all follow a curve that he can fit, and this work has then become quite widely quoted around the world. So if you sample your fluids and get an idea of what downhole temperatures would be, get an idea of what producing enthalpies might be, you can then use a chart like this to think about how efficiently I could get fluid into electricity with actual plant data informing the process. The other thing that you want to think about in your plant is even the best plants do not run 100% of the time. Any plant needs to be down for operations and maintenance routinely, preferably in a planned way as opposed to an unplanned. And the ratio of your actual output of your plant to its theoretical kind of design output is called a factor. It's a measure of how good the operations and maintenance on your plant is. So global capacity factors of different kinds of. So if you have a double flash plant, for example, you allow for about 9% of the time that being available because you need to be doing operations. Some plants typically do better than this, better than the global average, because we have a real strength and a real expertise. It's not just about drilling those wells, building, getting on one. You want to make sure that things stay on the stream. And I know it's with fouling and other challenges that hopefully now there are some ways to work through. So that really wraps up sort of a summary of some of the aspects of things happening in international geothermal experience. I have some slides here with some links, and I know a lot of people are taking photos, so I'll leave that one up for a second. That's the financial and drilling success type reports, and then the geothermics article on power plants and the J was presented in Indonesia last year on drilling. I would be happy to entertain questions either now or at 6 of the program. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Rosie. I think we have time. Are there any immediate questions?
And the fact to support the succeed geological type as a main 5 geological type, and what or major support the succeed rate?
But even if you zoom out for that answer as to what controls success, and at least in the database they didn't have it. And that may be just because they're a bit more limited in what data you can gather on such a big data set. For me, the real key to success in any geological type is understanding your subsurface in a very interdisciplinary way. So making sure that you have a conceptual model that honours your geophysics, that honours your geochemistry, honours temperature versus depth. Any data set that you can get all has to be honoured by a shared vision of what's under. So some projects are disconnected teams where geophysicists don't talk to the reservoir engineers, and they have their 3 separate views of the subsurface about the information.
Sorry,
That's fine.
I ask question is because in the Iran area, most of the geological type is low.
Dr. Bignall joined the GNS. Dr. Bignall managed the GNS geothermal, a government-funded multi-institutional geothermal research program. It's also called Geothermal Resources of New Zealand. And he represented New Zealand on the steering committee of the International Partnership for Geothermal Technology. And for the past 4 years, has been head of the Department of Thermal Sciences. He was the recipient of the 2018 Technical Office.
Firstly, Secretary General Sir, and thank you very much for your welcome to both for me and my colleagues, also to the provincial government for arranging such perfect weather. Since then, but also to all those graduate students, if you are thinking about writing papers, please do. It's really threefold. It's to a safer place, because we monitor the earthquakes and the volcanoes in the country. My voice suddenly went very deeper. And also to make New Zealand a more prosperous place. So that's really within So again, thank you very much for the opportunity to come here today and talk about some of the things that are happening in New Zealand, but also from my perspective, some of the things that have worked well in New Zealand and some of the things that have not worked well. And some of these lessons will be directly applicable to Taiwan in the future. And I hope that there will be some insights that the community here, because it's the perception of myself and others, we're all geothermal communities, so we're all working together on. But there'll be elements that you can say, oh, that from New Zealand, that will work really well here. This over here, that won't work quite so well. But if we can take little bits of information from all over the place, we can make some real progress and make some big advances in Taiwan. I also have a very similar history to Adrian, because my first introduction to geothermal was also in Rotorua. So my family moved to New Zealand when I was 10 years old, and my parents took myself and my sister to Rotorua, and I sat down on a rock and I watched the geysers and looked at the hot springs and was thoroughly amazed by what I saw in front of me. What I didn't realize was when I sat down, I sat on a hot rock and there was steam coming out. So it is really truthful to say that geothermal made a big impression on me. For my colleagues, so firstly, I'd just like to introduce a little bit about New Zealand. So we generate about 1,000 megawatts of installed capacity geothermal electricity generation in the country. It's taken more than 60 years to achieve that number, so it has been a long process, but that represents about 18% of our demand. Geothermal is very economically competitive, and our government is very dedicated to the greater use of renewable, low-emission geothermal energy resources, so this includes geothermal. And as part of that process, our government has streamlined the process for a lot of renewable energy schemes, and geothermal has benefited from that process. So we're now in a stage in New Zealand where our government has a target of 100% electricity generation from renewable resources by 2030. And that's a very challenging figure. 100% is a big number to be chasing. But that's the objective of our community, and that's the reason why we are looking at overcoming the challenges to achieve that goal in the future. This map shows the location of most of the geothermal activity in New Zealand. The The red circles represent the high temperature hot spring areas, and the blue circles represent the low temperature springs, so distributed throughout most of the country. And just like the location of Taiwan, New Zealand sits along the margin of two tectonic plates. In our case, we have the Pacific plate subducting beneath the Australian plate. Most of our high temperature resources, a number of these geothermal systems, the reservoir rocks are low-grade metamorphic rocks. And once we come down to the South Island, we're coming into tectonic regime, not the volcanic systems. So there is a great contrast within our country of different geological settings. And with those geological settings come a range of different scientific challenges to understand how the fluids move through the geothermal systems. So most of our developed geothermal systems in here, there is one area just up here, a place called Nafa in Northland. There's a power station in there as well. But increasingly, New Zealand will be looking at a lot of the smaller areas, the areas which are not volcanic hosted geothermal systems, for different types of activities. These they may be direct use. So it's a similar sort of scenario as exists in Taiwan. If you can understand the nature of the geology and the different geothermal systems, then you can undertake a different activity in that particular area. And we'll look at some of the examples where resources have been used in different ways. So this is the central North Island, and this is the area, as I suggested, where most of our high temperature geothermal systems are located. So one of the things from a New Zealand perspective is that the development of our geothermal systems are driven by industry and regulated by local government. So there are two provinces, Bay of Plenty province and the Waikato province, that to a large degree regulate and manage with the industry the geothermal resources within those areas. You'll also notice that some of the geothermal areas, so these are delineated by geophysics and by the distribution of hot springs at the surface. So these different geothermal areas are color-coded. The green areas are protected. The red areas are developed, and the yellow areas have some limited development possible. So this is an important aspect, that although New Zealand is moving forward with the exploration and utilization of the geothermal resources, we also have at the back of our mind the environmental management of those geothermal resources. And some of these areas are not developed because they have spectacular geothermal features, or they may have some particular important significance or spiritual importance to our indigenous Maori people. So finding that balance between using the geothermal resource for power or direct use, protecting the geothermal area for the future, is a key element. We talk about that when we are talking to kids. And this has been the cornerstone of the developments in New Zealand for the last 60 years. Testing your understanding of how the geothermal system works, recognizing those challenges, overcoming those challenges, and then moving forward with your best practice development model. And that's one of the things I think that is one of the areas in which Taiwan can also benefit from internationally. So developing a best practice guide, a best practice protocol specifically for Taiwan will enable a lot of initiatives, a lot of projects to move forward in a sustainable way. So going back in history, way beyond 1995, so geothermal has been used for a long time, and what they were doing. And then later in the 1940s, when New Zealand were undergoing power shortages, they recalled what they'd seen in Europe and started thinking about how geothermal might be developed in New Zealand. So the New Zealand government formed an advisory committee. They brought together the energy sector, they brought together the science community, and the drilling and works departments to start thinking about how geothermal might be used in New Zealand. And that was happening at about the same time as there was interest in the Wairakei geothermal area, not initially from a power generation perspective, but using the geothermal fluids as part of the heavy water plant for the United Kingdom atomic energy industry. As Rosalind mentioned, at this time, a lot of initiative from the New Zealand government to explore the geothermal potential of New Zealand and undertake the fundamental science investigations that 40, 50, 60 years later was giving the information to the industry to move forward with their exploration with reduced risk, greater knowledge about the geothermal resources. So between the 1950s through to the mid-1980s, the New Zealand government drilled about 120 wells in 14 different areas throughout New Zealand. And as I said, this was work that they undertook in partnership with the predecessor of GNS Science, which was the DSIR. So a lot of investigations were undertaken by the New Zealand government, and this gave the insight so that the industry subsequently could come to these areas and advance the investigations because they already had some good information. So this was Wairakei in the 1950s and 1960s. A lot of activities that were undertaken, groundbreaking engineering, groundbreaking science that was undertaken. The initiative, a new set of engineering challenges were identified, how to drill wells in the geothermal environment, what to do with the fluids that came to the surface. The initial thought that the fluid that would come to the surface would be steam, because that's what had been experienced in Italy, but discovering that it was a mix of water and vapor coming to the surface, how would that be managed? And the development of the Wairakei area. This evolved into the initial power station. This field produces more electricity now than at any time in its history. So the argument that thermal systems are not sustainable, it is not. Here's the perfect thing that a field that is well managed, that is well understood, is sustainable and can produce electricity for many years. And the Wairakei Power Station has evolved into the Wairakei Power Station, plus Tamihi Station, plus other field power stations around the field to be a very efficient, very well-run geothermal operation. That's not to say that there were not mistakes along the way. So recognizing the mistakes, learning how to drill the wells, learning about the consequences of the impacts on the hot springs, real concerns that a lot of people have for geothermal developments today, even from Taiwanese indigenous communities, worried about will the geothermal development have a negative impact on my hot springs? Because here is the evidence from the lessons learned of the past of the consequences. The argument to that is we do have far greater knowledge, far greater insight these days than we had back in here in the 1960s. So these kind of mistakes don't happen now. So this is a history of our electricity generation from geothermal resources over time. So at the moment, remember from my first slide, our target is 100% by 2030. We're about 85% at the moment from renewable resources. And geothermal is going to be a big factor in building up from 85 to get that 100%. Back in the 1950s, power station came online. The contribution from geothermal increased very rapidly. New Zealand started to develop hydro, and the contribution as a percentage to diminish. We had new generation in the late 1980s. Through here, a number of lessons learned as new fields came online, and from around about 2004, a significant increase in the amount of electricity that was being generated from geothermal resources to the 1,005 megawatts that we have today. New Zealand electricity generation. So in our two main islands, we have a network. Most of our generation occurs in the South Island, but most of our energy demand is in the North Island. So we have, at the moment, from gas, and geothermal is the one that has with reducing the dependence on thermal is the same challenge that we have in New Zealand, because a number of thermal power stations in New Zealand come offline, and we need to be looking at geothermal stepping up even more to make up for that shortfall and to plan into the future. So having a clear government-led initiative is a key element in the success of New Zealand, and I suggest a benefit for Taiwan in the future as well. Because this is the problem that we have in New Zealand. We have, from time to time, dry winters and dry summers, hot, dry summers. And in the future, this is the scenario that New Zealand has to potentially overcome. Because if we have a very high dependence on one form of energy from hydro, and the lake levels go down, then that causes problems for our country. Experience, because it's a continuously learning process. So this describes the scale of the geothermal developments. You can have extremely large developments. In the case of the Rotokawa plant, fairly rapid advance of the development through to a large power station. In the case of NAFA, this field is now going through an expansion program. So it's moving from 25 megawatts to 75 megawatts after a 20-year period. Power generation combined with milk powder, combined with farming, with horticulture. So different types of scale of direct heat applications. Understand the geothermal system, understand its characteristics, decide on what is the best application of that resource. So one of the big pushes in New Zealand is for the regional development. So the government sees that the enabling economic development in the regions, in the provincial areas, has a big impact on the vitality and the economics of the country as a whole. Develop new businesses, opportunities, employment. Geothermal attracts new business to those areas. Although the focus is on direct use, there's also an impact on power generation as well. So the government has embarked on 5 areas: engaging with industry, local government, public and Maori people, our indigenous Maori, promoting geothermal and teaching people about what's possible, connecting the geothermal users, the people without engagement with Maori. Kaitiaki is the Maori guardianship of the resource. So Maori people don't see themselves as owners of the resource, but they see themselves as the guardians, protectors of those geothermal systems. So that is an integral part of the partnership between industry, government, Maori, and potential developers of the geothermal systems. So Turapaki is a Maori company that partners with other power generating company in New Zealand. So they've been able to combine power generation, 113 megawatts, with their greenhouses, with their clean steam milk processing plants that talks to the dairy farm that they operate, because they are the land. Tree plant for planting tree for the trees. It connects with the worm farm, all part of a geothermal heat operation that derives from an initial exploration by the New Zealand government back in the 1980s. It's a very successful operation, integrating the lessons information that was undertaken, case studies, providing opportunities for interactive engagement, geothermal database, and on various people as well. So if we can educate and the young people, they will talk to the other decision makers. The other big plus for New Zealand is the geothermal institute. Rosalind, now I did get my PhD from this institution. So this very handsome man is a little bit more hair. Targeting too many wells. But an institution that has also grown and evolved and connects with our industry and provides lots of opportunities for training as well. So my recommendation, and I promise you, Rosalind gave me no money, but the graduate students, if you want the opportunity to also learn and bring that knowledge back to Taiwan, this type of institution and Geothermal Institute at Auckland is thoroughly recommended. It's good to me. Okay, so in summary, New Zealand's geothermal power generation is really driven by economics. It's not driven by policy, but it's opportunities for industry. At the moment, we're in a little bit of a static because too much electricity, but we can't sit back and wait. We have to keep on moving forward because fossil fuel plants will be closed and we need to have the security for the country. We've got lots of opportunities for more generation, and this is likely to occur in the next few years. And whilst we're learning about our geothermal resources, we haven't stopped learning about how we can better manage our geothermal systems, how our power stations can work most efficiently. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Information from all the sides, or
No, it's
in the future, all the private sector, according to the more information, they will invest to get the power plant, the project.
from my perspective, it's a partnership. I mean, we all have the same goals, and for